Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer, I think us up here, we have dreams, we have hopes, we have wishes. We want to be bold to make this a better California. We want to be the leader of making sure that women of color continue to be treated equally to their counterparts. And our next panel, I would invite you to come up as I introduce the first speaker. For those of you that don't know, it's Ms. Alvarez and Ms. Vega. And I will introduce our first person that will be speaking. These are experts that will be focusing on the minimum wage and the problem of the wage theft. We first have with us, and I want to make sure that I pronounce your name correctly, Sayaru Jayaram. And she actually is co-director of Restaurant Opportunity Center United, as well as a lecturer at the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. And it is an honor to have you here. You are an expert, and we look forward to your expertise on educating us. I'm going to ask the other two individuals to come up, and then I will introduce you in a minute. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for having me, and thanks very much to ERA for their leadership on this issue. I actually run a research center at UC Berkeley called the Food Labor Research Center, and have been studying and organizing and working in the food system, workers in the food system, for the last 15 years. And I want to focus today in particular on the restaurant industry. It's the industry that I've spent the most time writing and working in. The restaurant industry is the second largest and absolute fastest growing sector of the U.S. economy, and in California, it is the largest employer of women, and is the absolute lowest paying. 1 in 12 Americans and 1 in 12 Californians works in the restaurant industry, and yet it happens to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the U.S. and in California. Every year, the U.S. Department of Labor puts out a list of the 10 lowest paying jobs in America, and every year 7 of the 10 are restaurant jobs, and actually only 1 of those 7 lowest paying jobs that's a restaurant job is a fast food occupation. 6 of the 7 lowest paying jobs in America and in the restaurant industry are full service restaurant occupations. 4 of them are actually tipped occupations. And all of our research as to how you've got one of the largest and fastest growing sectors of the California economy and the U.S. economy proliferating the absolute lowest paying jobs in the state and in the country is the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby I'm sure you've encountered called the National Restaurant Association, or its state affiliate, the California Restaurant Association. It's been named the 10th most powerful lobbying group in Congress. And in doing research for my next book, coming out next week, actually come to find that the power of this trade lobby doesn't date back 20 or 30 years. It dates back 150 years to the emancipation of the slaves. When tipping first came to the United States from Europe, the Restaurant Association actually demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves and not pay them anything and let them live on customer tips. And that idea that a former slave could be paid nothing was codified into the very first minimum wage law passed in 1938 under the New Deal under FDR, which said that a worker has the right to the minimum wage either through wages or through tips. And we've gone from a $0 minimum wage in 1938 for tipped workers, restaurant workers, to a whopping $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage in 2016 for tipped workers in the United States. So over a 150-year period, the Restaurant Association nationally and here in California has used exactly the same argument, that these are well-paid, wealthy white steakhouse servers serving at a fine dining steakhouse here in Sacramento, when in fact we know that 70% of tipped restaurant workers in America, a full 6 million workers, a full 600,000 workers here in California, are women. Women who work in IHOP and Applebee's and Olive Garden, women who suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce, use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce, and suffer from the absolute worst sexual harassment of any industry in the United States or in California, because when you're a woman living off tips, as I may imagine you might have in some portion of your life, most people have, you know that you have to tolerate whatever a customer might do to you, however they may touch you or treat you or talk to you, because the customer is always right. The customer pays your bills, not your employer. Now, California is one of 7 states in the union that has long rejected this idea of a 2-tiered wage system and has demanded that this industry pay the full wage. That doesn't mean that California restaurant workers and women in this industry don't have challenges. California is, in fact, the largest restaurant industry in the country. It's 1 million restaurant workers. 1 in 11 U.S. restaurant workers works in California. And it actually has the largest restaurant industry of any city in the United States. LA has a larger restaurant industry than New York City. But the California Restaurant Association has repeatedly attempted to introduce a lower wage for tipped workers. Every time the minimum wage is proposed to be raised in any city in California, the California Restaurant Association shows up and says, well, our neighboring states of Arizona and New Mexico have wages as little as $2 and $3 and $4 an hour. Why can't we have a lower wage for tipped workers? This would introduce a significant, even more significant wage disparity for women in our industry than already exists. And it's not like women in California don't already face severe problems with sexual harassment. The higher we raise the wage in this industry, the less dependent we make women in this industry on tips, the less likely we make them to have to be vulnerable and exposed to customers having to tolerate inappropriate behavior from customers. So what we are asking for is not only that we raise the wage in California, the minimum wage, let it be $15 as it should be, the minimum that it should be for a decent, livable wage, minimum wage, but let us ensure that there's ironclad language that we can never introduce a lower wage for tipped workers in this state, because that would be essentially legalizing gender pay inequity in a state that's already dealing with severe gender pay equity issues. So that's one set of issues. The second pot of issues, and I'm so glad you're focusing on women of color in particular, is that our industry is severely segregated by race and gender. What most people don't know is that our industry actually has a significant number of livable wage jobs. A good 20% of our industry, although we are the largest employer of minimum wage workers in the state, we are also the employer of about 20% of jobs that actually pay livable wages. These jobs are largely fine dining server and bartending positions, and they are largely held by white men. We've done actually what's called match pairs audit testing studies, where we've sent hundreds of pairs of white and people of color applicants, men and women, into fine dining restaurants to see who gets hired. We found that white men have twice the chance of a person of color of getting one of these livable wage fine dining jobs, even when the person of color has a better resume. And so what we see is that women of color are segregated into lower tipping restaurants like IHOPs and Applebee's. They're also segregated into lower level segments of the industry like casual and fast food. They're also segregated into lower level positions like servers as opposed to bartenders. All of this results for black women in a $600,000 loss of income, black women versus white men, over a lifetime. That's enough to buy a home. And so what we need to think about are policies that both lift the floor and build the ladder. And I hope you'll keep that frame in mind throughout today. Lifting the floor and building the ladder. That's the way to close the wage gap. That's the way to help women of color in the state. Lift the floor means increase the minimum wage for all workers, exclude nobody, especially do not exclude tipped workers. Build the ladder means support training programs and education for women, but it also means support policies that incentivize employers to promote from within, to hire women of color, and actually equalize the playing field. In Oakland, we are actually piloting with the city a policy that would actually incentivize employers to promote from within. We've got some fabulous employers. I will close with this because I know I'm out of time. We've got some fabulous employers that have worked with us, about 170 of them, restaurant owners across the country and here in California, that have worked with us to form an alternative National Restaurant Association, alternative California Restaurant Association called RAISE. We're happy to bring them to the state capitol and have them testify and tell you how they as employers believe in higher wages, no exclusion for tipped workers, better benefits, pathways for women of color. They believe, like us, that the only way to actually address issues for this population is to actually lift the floor and build the ladder. And I'll just say, you know, right now 1 in 3 Americans and 1 in 3 Californians works and lives in poverty. By 2020, some economists assume that it will be 1 in 2. That means half of all working Americans and half of all working Californians will live in poverty. And we spend as taxpayers $9.5 billion annually on publicly funded public assistance, taxpayer-funded public assistance for full-service restaurant workers, another $7 billion for fast food restaurant workers, taxpayer-funded public assistance, a total of $16.5 billion annually spent on taxpayer-funded public assistance for an industry that expects us to subsidize its workers' wages through tips and expects us to subsidize its workers' livelihood through public assistance. So the question is, if we are ultimately going to be a state that can support itself, where people can thrive and support the economy, how can we allow this industry to continue in the way it has been going? I have to leave, I'm sorry, but I brought books for you all. Oh, thank you so much. And I'm sorry I have to run to pick up my child.
Thank you. We all understand that. So at this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to our next speaker, Maria Alvarez. Do I have, that's, wait, the agenda's wrong. It is Maria, though. Dime tu nombre.
Ada Loera. It's Ada Maria Loera.
Okay. A janitor worker at Pfizer, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. In La Jolla, and SEI United Service Worker, Western member who will address minimum wage enforcement issues and the problem of wage theft. That's the thing. Things evolved and people change. So the floor is yours. Please address the issue, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, like you heard, my name's Ada Loera, and I'm a janitor at Pfizer in La Jolla, California. I'm a wife. I'm a mother. I have a 19-year-old kid in college right now, and I'm the primary breadwinner. First, I want to thank you for holding this hearing to listen to women like me and our needs. This doesn't happen very often. I work day cleaning an office building for that large company, research company, and sometimes feels like we live in a different world, you know. You see disparities. I've been working as a janitor for 5 years. Most people don't see us or see our work until we're not there, right? We're the force behind the clean restrooms and the offices and making minimum wage. Most of our janitors are women, and most janitors are women of color. Most of us are immigrants or second generation U.S. born, and we look for work, and sometimes this is all you can find. I believe all these things make it easier for the building owners and janitorial contractors to treat us like we aren't human beings. It gets to a point where they have reduced the amount of people working and double the workload for the people that are there. For my hard work, yeah, I earn $10.33 an hour, and that makes me one of the lucky ones, because many don't even earn the minimum wage. I have friends that have been working and they get cheated out of their salary, their overtime, any kind of benefit, anything that they can call and say, I have proof that I've been working, you know. So to me, I find myself lucky. But surviving on 1033 and raising a family on low wages is a constant battle, a struggle, and it's stressful. My husband lays asphalt. His work is not steady, and it depends on the weather. Raising the salary to $15 would give us much-deserved breathing room we desperately need for our basic needs. I work 2 jobs to make ends meet, and there's never enough time to work some more, to earn some more money. I do find that equal pay for equal work is still not a reality, even with us in our company. Our male counterpart, they earn at least 50 cents more than we do. They do less than we do, and they're pampered, I guess. Another issue, it was in 2014, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Thankfully, we have insurance coverage through our union. Otherwise, it would have been like $500-something a month for the premium that the company was offering us. With the extra costs, I don't think I would have paid for anything. Probably would have let it go. We struggled to cover and our expenses, and we only survived because our friends and family helped us. They stepped in. I worked until chemotherapy made it too hard to walk. Finally, I was disabled, and I had to go on family medical leave, which was very hard financially, because you really don't get what you were earning, unless it was a disability due through an accident at work. I do anything for my family, but I got to a point you have to stay home. I don't think most people value us or really see who we are. We're like the invisible people, or the invisible crew that takes care of your restrooms, takes care of your offices, your homes, even sometimes kids. So we're not appreciated until we're not there. A lot of the janitors are not treated well, even if you have union. Most of us don't. It's hard to get ahead because all the rest of the companies are paying their workers less and treating them badly. Wage theft, no benefits, health and safety violations, disrespect, and even abuse. How am I ever going to be treated like a human being and valued if 90% of janitors around me are treated like they are disposable, like trash? I believe the state of California needs to do something, and they need to hurry up and do it now. The state needs to work with us workers and with our unions to make sure that women like me are protected and treated like human beings. Thank you. That's all from me. Thanks for listening to us.
Thank you so much for being here. Our final speaker is Ms. Vega, and she's a legislative advocate for the California Labor Federation that specializes in workers' rights and in activism for fair wages. Thank you for being here, Ms. Vega.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this very important hearing. I am honored to get to represent the labor movement here in Sacramento and speak on behalf of so many unions and workers in so many different kinds of industries. At this point, the labor movement is now about half women, and so we do see the challenges of women of color, low-wage women, and particularly low-wage women who do not have the protection of a union. So as we talk about kind of what a concentration there is among minimum wage workers, that so many of them are women, it kind of makes me think the problems we tend to identify as the problems of low-wage workers really also need to be thought of as women's issues, right? So as we see this economy changing, being a minimum wage worker is not just about not making enough money. We see now not only an increase in wage theft, workers having to work off the clock, not being paid for the hours that they work. We see employers using contractors, and Ada spoke about it, using contractors to hide behind them so that the workers can be abused and there's no accountability. And this means even greater challenges for women workers in trying to hold the boss accountable, particularly when it comes to issues like sexual harassment and sexual assault on the job. There was an article this morning in the New York Times about farm worker women and the prevalence of male supervisors demanding sex in exchange for maintaining their jobs, that these women were told as immigrant women, this is the way it is here. You come here and that's how you keep your job. These women then become trapped. They can't go home and tell their husbands what's happening because then they'll lose the income they need to take care of their families. So in addition to all the problems we think of as the challenges faced by farm workers working, long hours without daily overtime, which we hope to change this year, working around dangerous pesticides, doing stoop labor. In addition to all of those problems that women farm workers have to face, they also have to face these kinds of gendered attacks every day at the workplace. We are also increasingly seeing among low-wage workers a complete lack of security. So where in the old days, even if someone was only making minimum wage, they would get a schedule and they'd get a certain number of hours. It was in general, a full-time job with a guarantee of hours. We are increasingly seeing employers move away from that model and expect workers to live basically in on-call status. You're just there, we call you when we need you. And as women workers, not only does that mean more women are faced with coping with those kinds of conditions, but oftentimes we are the ones responsible for the family care, for children, for elderly parents, and not ever knowing ahead of time whether you'll have enough hours, whether you can fit in a second job. As Ada said, there's never enough time to do as much work as you need to make ends meet. But these kinds of issues hit women workers harder, not having a guarantee of your hours. Misclassification. There's a lot of talk right now about this on-demand economy where so many workers are labeled as independent contractors. Again, this takes away the entire social safety net. So Ada was just talking about going on disability, going on FMLA, family medical leave. When you're misclassified as an independent contractor, none of those benefits are available. If you become ill, if you have a family member who you need to take care of, nothing applies to you. In addition, you are not even entitled to the minimum wage. So a lot of the issues we're talking about today are about minimum wage workers. You're not even entitled to that. In addition, women making minimum wage struggle during their working years, even more so when they face retirement. These women tend to have no retirement and no savings. There was a recent article about how age discrimination is increasingly harder on women, that women over 50 are having a harder time finding jobs in this economy. And when you think about women who have no retirement, who have no savings, and then are facing age discrimination, oftentimes, again, being primary caregivers, having children, siblings, parents who they are trying to provide for, it really is a no-win situation. In terms of enforcement, we know that the Labor Commissioner's Office does a good job in trying to make the best with what they have, but their resources are so inadequate. In fact, there are counties in the state that have one inspector for the entire county to do field enforcement. So when you're talking about a workforce that really is not empowered to come forward and report complaints because they'll lose their job, they're reliant on there being a labor law enforcement program that can ensure that their rights are being protected. And we simply do not have that in this state. We have to make an investment in greater resources to the Labor Commissioner's Office to ensure that there is that avenue for women. In addition, we did a bill last year, the Labor Federation, around forced arbitration. We're increasingly seeing women having to sign these arbitration agreements upon hire. Often these are low-wage workers, and these are in these industries, predominantly women. These arbitration agreements give up your right to go to the labor commissioner or to court for virtually everything, including sexual harassment, gender discrimination, as well as every other kind of labor violation. And so how can we try to fight to protect low-wage workers when administrative resources are inadequate and when women are required to sign away their rights as a condition of getting a job? I have to just return to where Ms. Gonzalez began this hearing with our reality that the greatest protection for women is having a union contract, both in terms of pay equity, because we negotiate a rate and that rate is going to apply based on your seniority, and no other factors. It's not about favoritism. It's not about who dates the boss. It's not about whether they prioritize men or whether they prioritize white workers over workers of color. There is one rate, and that rate is locked in and negotiated. In addition, that gives you an enforcement mechanism that cannot be waived upon hire. So for that reason, union women make 33% more than non-union women. Latina union women make 46% more than non-union women. And so I think when we talk about what else we can do here, it really is about expanding and protecting the right to organize, promoting the growth of union jobs where we know that women will have these rights and protections, and encouraging women to go into the many fields where there is strong union density and where we can encourage the right to organize. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vega, and we appreciate all of you coming today. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Brown, and she will introduce the next panel.
Thank you so much. The information today has been invaluable, and I'm looking forward to what legislation is going to come out of this. The next panel is valuing work in occupations dominated by women. As we know, women dominate many industries. I can remember when women were all the nurses, and nurses didn't get paid a whole lot. My husband worked at Kaiser, and that was his job. And one of the things he would talk about is, there's women in this, but whenever affirmative action came in, they said, men have rights too. Well, all of a sudden, all of the salaries went up because they did introduce men into that. Yeah. So now you go in and women really have to compete with the men in those high-paying jobs. But valuing the work, we have Katie Joaquin, Sylvia Lopez, Nina Ruiz, and Tanya McMillan. If you'll come forward. Who will start?
I can begin. Thank you, Assembly Member. And my name's Katie Joaquin, and my first exposure to the domestic work industry was joining my grandmother and my aunties while they were doing the work in Connecticut and in New York, and now for the past 10 years organizing with domestic workers against wage theft and for dignity in the home. And I'm currently the campaign director of the California Domestic Workers Coalition, and all of our members are people that are doing the work work of caring for people's homes, for their children. They're the bridge to independent living for seniors and for people with disabilities. In California, there's over 308,000 domestic workers that are doing this work privately paid, either directly by families or by agencies, and that's by very conservative estimates. And these are majority women of color who are primary breadwinners for their own families. And they're doing this work that makes all other work possible, that is a backbone of the economy in the U.S. And despite the central role that their work plays, their jobs are often substandard jobs. And when they're experiencing problems at work, they're often experiencing it alone, in isolation without the benefit of a sympathetic coworker. They're experiencing it with limited state and federal protections, and also with little power to assert their rights or access to collective bargaining. And we have some incredible leaders with us today, Sylvia and Nena, that have been part of the movement to really turn this tide and have been working diligently to expand labor protections for the domestic workforce. And so I'll just briefly close with a little bit of the historic context as to, why are domestic workers left out of these basic protections? And in this country, it's really rooted in a historic devaluation of women's work and also in this country's legacy of slavery. And so the very first domestic workers in this country were African Americans, people that were doing work in the fields and in the homes. And when the very first landmark labor legislation was passed in 1938, it was only passed It was only allowed to pass by Southern congressmen if it excluded African American farm workers and domestic workers. And then here in California, California began to regulate this industry with the Industrial Welfare Commission Wage Order 15 in 1976. But specifically personal attendance, so domestic workers that care for people were left out, whereas those that were caring for property were not, were left out of basic rights to overtime protections and breaks. And part of the reasoning to that was that the people doing this work are doing it merely as a source of rewarding activity, merely for supplemental income, which we know isn't the case. This is a workforce that is doing this to support their own families here and also to prop up economies of countries around the world where they're also supporting their family members. And so Sylvia and Nena will speak to what have the impacts been, the impacts of workers being left out of these protections, and also the impacts of when workers have been able to expand and defend and assert their rights. And so we can begin with Sylvia, and I could translate for her.